The early evening sky over Connecticut was streaked with hues of amber and deep purple as Ethan Carter turned onto the long, familiar driveway that led to his mother's house. He hadn't told anyone he was coming back early from his business trip in Boston. He wanted the surprise to be memorable. It was his mother's birthday, after all, and despite the strained phone calls of the past year, he still cared deeply for her. The sound of music reached him before the house came into full view, a lively mix of laughter, clinking glasses, and classic rock pulsing from open windows. The front lawn was dotted with cars, some parked haphazardly on the grass, a testament to how many people had shown up. As he stepped out of the car, the chill in the autumn air caught him by surprise. Connecticut in late October had a way of biting through even the thickest jackets when the sun dipped below the trees. He zipped up his coat, adjusted his overnight bag over one shoulder, and walked toward the porch. That was when he saw him. Sitting on a worn, creaky wooden bench just outside the front door was his grandfather, Thomas Carter. The old man was hunched over, his frail shoulders wrapped in a thin cardigan far too light for the weather. His hands trembled slightly in his lap, and his lips had a bluish tinge that sent a jolt through Ethan's chest. He stopped in his tracks, stunned. No one else was outside. The lights inside flickered against the windows, casting dancing shadows across Thomas's hunched frame. Music thumped from within, oblivious, indifferent. Ethan dropped his bag and rushed up the steps. "Grandpa," he said, kneeling in front of him. Thomas looked up slowly, his eyes taking a moment to register the face before him. Then, a faint smile broke through the haze. "Ethan," he said, his voice dry and thin. "You came. What are you doing out here? It's freezing." Ethan took off his coat without hesitation, wrapping it around the old man's shoulders. The cardigan underneath was little more than a threadbare relic. "How long have you been sitting here?" Thomas shook his head slightly, eyes drifting toward the door. "I don't know. A while, maybe. I didn't want to bother them." "Bother them?" Ethan's voice rose, incredulous. "You're sitting out here in the cold, and they're partying inside?" Thomas gave a slow shrug, the kind that spoke more defeat than indifference. Ethan helped him to his feet. He felt lighter than he should have, and guided him back to the bench, adjusting the coat tightly around him. "Stay here. I'll be right back," Ethan said, his voice tight with anger. He pushed the front door open and stepped into a blast of warm air and chatter. The hallway was crowded with shoes and coats, the scent of catered food hanging heavy in the air. Voices echoed from the living room, where people were gathered with drinks in hand, laughing around a birthday cake. At the center of it all stood his mother, dressed in a glittering blouse, chatting with guests like nothing in the world could touch her. Ethan scanned the room quickly. Familiar faces, distant cousins, his Aunt Martha, Uncle Robert, his sister Jenna. Everyone was there. He spotted his cousin Lindsay near the snack table, sipping from a red cup. "Lindsay," he called out sharply. She turned, surprised, and blinked at him. "Ethan?" "Oh my God, you're back," she said, moving to hug him, but he stepped back. "Why is Grandpa outside?" Her expression faltered. "What?" "Outside. Freezing. Alone. On the porch." She rolled her eyes and waved a hand dismissively. He was bothering everyone. He kept rambling on about old times, confusing people. Honestly, it was getting weird. Ethan stared at her, unable to believe what he was hearing. "So you just put him outside?" "He wanted to go," she said quickly. "Said he needed air. And none of you checked on him?" Lindsay took another sip and shrugged. "Look, he's old. Sometimes he doesn't make sense. We didn't want to ruin the mood." Ethan's fists clenched. Without another word, he turned and stormed back to porch. Thomas was still sitting there, shivering despite the coat. Ethan knelt again and looked into his grandfather's eyes. "Come on, I'm taking you inside." "I don't want to ruin anything," Thomas murmured. "You're not ruining anything," Ethan said firmly. "This is your house too." But as he helped his grandfather to his feet again, Ethan couldn't shake the chill that had settled over him, one that had nothing to do with the cold. It came from the faces he'd just seen, the voices he'd heard, and the utter absence of empathy in a house that used to be filled with love. As they crossed the threshold together, Ethan knew one thing for certain. Something was very wrong in this family, and he wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. He led his grandfather into the living room, where the warmth and noise immediately returned. Heads turned. Conversation paused. His mother's eyes widened at the sight of Thomas draped in Ethan's coat, leaning heavily on his grandson's arm. And for the first time that evening, silence fell. A thick tension blanketed the living room as Ethan stood beside his grandfather, still holding him by the arm. The birthday celebration had ground to a halt. Plates were abandoned mid-meal. Cups hovered in midair, and conversations died in throats as the entire room processed what they were seeing. Thomas Carter, the patriarch who had once been at the center of every family gathering, was now the unexpected guest. Frozen, frail, and visibly out of place. Ethan didn't wait for an invitation. He guided Thomas to the nearest armchair and gently lowered him into it, then turned to the room with a calm that barely masked his fury. "He's staying in here," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Not outside, not in the cold, and definitely not alone." The silence lingered a few seconds longer before a nervous laugh broke the tension. It came from Uncle Robert, who had already poured himself another glass of scotch. "Ethan, come on. You're blowing this out of proportion." Ethan ignored him. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on his mother, Diane, who still stood rooted near the cake table. Her mouth was slightly open, as if caught mid-word, her hands clutching a plate of untouched dessert. "Mom," Ethan asked pointedly, "you were okay with him being outside?" Diane blinked and quickly placed the plate down, smoothing the front of her blouse. "We thought he needed space," she said, trying to keep her voice level. "He's been a little off lately, talking nonsense. He wanted to be alone." Ethan crossed his arms. "That's an excuse?" He wanted to be alone in 40 degree, whether while the rest of you were in here laughing and drinking. Jenna, his younger sister, stepped forward. She looked uncomfortable, her eyes darting between Ethan and the rest of the family. "Ethan, he's been confusing people lately, saying weird stuff. He repeats himself a lot. Sometimes he just stares off, and honestly, it makes people uncomfortable." "So you exile him?" Ethan shot back. "You humiliate him in his own house." "We didn't humiliate anyone," Lindsay chimed in from the corner, her earlier indifference now colored by irritation. "It's not like we locked him out. He sat on the porch because he wouldn't stop talking about things from, 40 years ago. None of us even knew what he meant. He just kept rambling." Thomas, who had remained quiet until then, looked down at his lap. His hands were still trembling slightly, but not from the cold now. It was something deeper. Ethan looked at him, then back at the others. "Did any of you stop to think that maybe he's lonely? That maybe he just wanted someone to listen?" There was a long pause before Diane responded. "Ethan, I don't think you understand how hard it's been. Ever since Mom died, he's changed. He doesn't help with anything, barely talks to anyone unless it's about the past, and honestly, it's draining." Ethan took a breath, steadying himself. "He doesn't help? This is the man who paid off your mortgage when Dad left. The man who drove me and Jenna to school for 3 years. Who picked up groceries, fixed a fence, kept the garden alive. Now you act like he's a burden?" Robert scoffed. "That was years ago. People age. People forget. We're doing the best we can." "No, you're doing what's convenient," Ethan snapped. "And there's a big difference." The room fell quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence this time. Thicker, heavier. No one met Ethan's eyes. Jenna shifted awkwardly. Diane picked at her bracelet, and Lindsay busied herself with her phone, pretending not to be part of the conversation. Ethan knelt beside Thomas again. "Are you hungry, Grandpa?" Thomas nodded slowly. "A little." Ethan stood. "He's eating with us tonight, at the table." Robert muttered something under his breath, but Diane raised a hand. "Fine," she said, the edge in her voice betraying her discomfort, "if that's what he wants." Ethan didn't wait for anyone else. He walked to the dining room and began clearing space at the main table, moving a decorative centerpiece and pulling up an extra chair. The clatter of dishes was the only sound as he returned, helped Thomas to his feet, and guided him to the seat. A few relatives tried to resume their conversations, their voices subdued now, but the air remained brittle. No one looked directly at Thomas. A few offered weak smiles. Others turned their heads entirely. Ethan sat beside his grandfather, keeping close watch on him. The old man ate slowly, quietly, as if unsure whether he was truly allowed to be there. Ethan didn't speak for the rest of the meal. He just stayed present, steady, a silent shield against the cold indifference of the room. After dinner, most of the guests filtered out quickly. The celebration had lost its shine, and the house emptied faster than expected. Diane barely said goodbye to anyone. Jenna retreated to the kitchen to help clean, while Robert and Martha disappeared upstairs with vague murmurs about getting some rest. Only Ethan and Thomas remained in the living room. The cake had been cut, the gifts opened and forgotten. A few plates still sat on the coffee table, half-eaten slices melting into crumbs. The fire in the hearth had dimmed. Thomas shifted in his seat, breaking the silence. "You didn't have to do all that." "Yes, I did," Ethan replied quietly. "You don't deserve to be treated like that. No one does." Thomas gave a slow nod, eyes fixed on the dying fire. "I think I stayed quiet too long, hoping it would change." "It still can," Ethan said, "but not if we let them pretend this is okay." Thomas turned his head slightly, studying his grandson. "You've grown into a good man, Ethan." Ethan smiled faintly. "I had a good example." Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves scraped along the windows like brittle fingers. The warmth inside the room was fragile, built from a moment of defiance, a single act of kindness. But for the first time that evening, Ethan felt like he had done something that mattered. Tomorrow, he would start asking more questions. He would dig deeper. Something was off in this house, something more than neglect, and he intended to find out exactly what it was. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. Most of the family had either gone home or disappeared into their respective corners, avoiding Ethan entirely. Even the lingering smell of food and birthday candles had faded, replaced by the muted aroma of stale coffee and silence. Ethan had barely slept. He'd spent most of the night lying on the pull-out couch in the den, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events from a night before. No matter how many times he ran through it, he couldn't find a justification for what had happened. The way they all looked at Thomas, the way they spoke about him like he wasn't even in the room. It was more than just age or confusion. It was deliberate distance, like it had already been written out of the family narrative and nobody had told him yet. By 7 o'clock in the morning, Ethan was up and dressed, his coffee untouched on the kitchen counter. He found Thomas in the sunroom, seated in the same wicker chair he used to occupy years ago when reading the newspaper on Sunday mornings. But this morning, there was no newspaper, just a blank stare through the window at the half-dead garden outside. The sun was barely up, casting a dull silver sheen over the backyard. "Morning, Grandpa," Ethan said softly, stepping into the room. Thomas didn't turn to look. "Morning," he said after a pause, his voice barely louder than a whisper. Ethan sat in the chair across from him, the one with the cushion that always sagged in the middle. "You're up early." Thomas nodded faintly. "Hard to sleep these days." They sat in silence for a long moment, the kind that felt too heavy to be peaceful. Ethan wanted to ask so many questions. Why Thomas hadn't told him what was really going on, how long he had been treated like this, whether he was okay. But he knew better than to start with too much. His grandfather had always been a quiet man, but now that quiet felt like a shell. And Ethan needed to figure out what had driven him into it. "Do you want to go for a walk later? Just the two of us?" Ethan asked. Thomas hesitated, then shook his head. "Not today. Maybe tomorrow." Ethan nodded, even though he could feel disappointment rising in his chest. He didn't press. "Okay, tomorrow then." He stood and walked to the kitchen, where Diane was already awake, seated at the breakfast table with her tablet and a cup of tea. She looked up when he entered, but said nothing. Ethan leaned against the counter. "I'm taking a few days off work. Thought I'd stick around." She didn't look thrilled. "That's unexpected." "Yeah, well," he said, "so we're seeing Grandpa left outside in the cold." Diane let out a sigh and set the tablet down. "Ethan, I'm not trying to argue with you, but you being here doesn't change the fact that your grandfather's been different. Different isn't the same as disposable," Ethan said. "No one said he's disposable. You said he's draining. Jenna said he's uncomfortable to be around. Lindsay said he rambles too much. That's not concern. That's dismissal. Diane rubbed her temples. We've all been dealing with a lot since your grandmother passed. It's been a hard adjustment. Ethan nodded slowly. I understand that, but I'm staying. And while I'm here, I'm going to spend time with him, whether you all like it or not. Diane didn't respond. Instead, she picked up her tablet again and resumed reading. Ethan returned to the sunroom. Thomas was still seated in the same spot, his expression unchanged. This time, Ethan sat down and just started talking, not about what had happened the night before, not about the tension in the house, but about little things. His work, the cities he'd visited, the people he met. He spoke gently, slowly, giving Thomas space to respond if he wanted to. But mostly, he just listened to the silence. Eventually, Thomas said, Your grandmother used to sit there, same time every morning. Ethan glanced at the chair beside him. The cushion was newer than the others, one of the few changes that had happened in the sunroom over the years. I remember, he said, she always had a crossword puzzle and a cup of black tea. Thomas smiled faintly, the first real sign of emotion since the previous night. She had a mind like a steel trap, never needed a pen, just read the clues out loud and solve them in her head. She loved those puzzles, Ethan said, smiling. Thomas's smile faded. It's not the same without her. Ethan let the silence settle again. The sun had risen a little higher now, casting warmer light through the windows. It made the dust in the air visible, tiny particles floating in slow spirals. After a while, Ethan asked, Why didn't you tell me things were getting this bad around here? Thomas looked down at his hands. What would have been the point? I could have helped. You're busy. Your life's out there, not in here. That doesn't mean I don't care, Ethan said. You helped raise me. Thomas looked up, his gaze sharp for the first time. And you're the only one who remembers that. The words hit Ethan like a punch. He didn't know how to respond, so he just nodded. That afternoon, Ethan offered to drive Thomas into town to pick up a few things from the pharmacy. It was a small trip, something mundane, but he figured it might give his grandfather a change of scenery. At first, Thomas declined, but when Ethan insisted, the old man finally agreed. The ride was quiet, but not uncomfortably so. As they passed familiar streets, Thomas occasionally pointed out places in the past, the diner that used to serve the best cherry pie, the hardware store that closed down 15 years ago, the old high school where Diane once taught art before quitting to focus on a family. Ethan took mental notes. Every story mattered now. At the pharmacy, Thomas waited in the car while Ethan picked up his prescriptions. When he came back, Thomas was staring out the window at a woman walking her dog. His expression was unreadable. Everything okay? Ethan asked, climbing back into the driver's seat. Thomas nodded. Just thinking. About what? Thomas didn't answer right away. Then he said, about how fast everything changes. One day, you're the one people ask for advice. The next, they pretend you're not even in the room. Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. That's not how it's supposed to be. No, Thomas agreed, but it's how it is. Later that evening, after they returned home, Ethan found a stack of unopened mail addressed to Thomas sitting by the front door. Most were bills, a few junk flyers, but one caught his eye. It was a letter from a law office. It had been opened, but not by Thomas. The seal was broken, and the letter was folded unevenly, like someone else had rifled through it. Ethan didn't say anything at the moment, but he pocketed the envelope quietly. He helped Thomas to bed that night, bringing him a glass of water and checking that the space heater in his room was working. The room was smaller than it used to be, moved from the upstairs master suite to a guest room on the ground floor. The reason, Diane had once said, was that it was easier this way. Ethan wasn't so sure. Before leaving the room, Ethan paused at the door. Good night, Grandpa. Thomas looked over at him, eyes dim but warm. Good night, Ethan. Thank you. Ethan turned off the light and closed the door behind him. He went back to the den and unfolded the letter from the law office, smoothing out the wrinkles. As he read, A knot began forming in his stomach. The letter mentioned estate matters, financial holdings, and something about property transfer. It didn't make sense that no one had discussed this with Thomas, unless they had, and just chose not to let him in on it. Ethan folded the letter again and slipped it into his bag. Tomorrow, he would start digging, not just into the treatment of his grandfather, but into everything the family had been hiding, and he had a feeling it would be worse than he imagined. The next morning brought with it sharp clarity, both in the crisp air outside and in Ethan's resolve. He woke early again, unable to rest with everything swirling through his mind. The letter from the law office was folded neatly in the inside pocket of his coat, now hanging by the front door. He hadn't shown it to anyone yet, not even Thomas, and he didn't plan to, not until he understood what it meant and who had seen it first. The house was quiet at first, but it didn't take long before the usual friction returned. Ethan was in the kitchen making breakfast, eggs, toast, and fresh coffee, when Jenna walked in, already dressed in her yoga gear and sipping from a protein shake. "Making breakfast for the king?" she asked, her tone light, but laced with something sharper underneath. Ethan glanced at her. "Making breakfast for my grandfather, yeah." She sat at the counter, watching him. "You're really leaning into this whole savior thing." He didn't answer immediately. He plated the eggs, dropped toast on the side, then poured a second cup of coffee and added just the right amount of cream, the way Thomas had always liked it. "I'm just doing what any decent person would." Jenna rolled her eyes. "Right, because we're all indecent now." Ethan set the plate down with a little more force than necessary. "You said he makes people uncomfortable. You let him sit outside in the cold. If you don't want to be called indecent, maybe stop acting like it." Before she could answer, Thomas shuffled into the room, wearing a thick sweater Ethan had brought down from the attic. The sleeves were too long, but it was clean and warm. His steps were slow but steady, and he smiled faintly when he saw Ethan waiting with breakfast. "Smells good," he said. Ethan pulled out the chair and helped him sit. "You're just in time." Jenna didn't say another word. She left her shake on the counter and walked out, her silence louder than any insult she might have thrown. Ethan didn't watch her go. He focused on Thomas, who started eating with quiet appreciation. Not long after, Diane entered the kitchen, freshly showered and with her makeup already done. She paused when she saw Thomas at the table. "I thought you were still asleep," she said, then glanced at Ethan. "He usually sleeps late." "Not today," Ethan said simply. She poured herself coffee but didn't join them. Instead, she hovered by the fridge, pretending to be looking for something. Thomas didn't acknowledge her, and she didn't greet him. The chill in the room had nothing to do with the weather. That afternoon, they gathered in the living room for a family lunch, something Diane insisted on, hoping to restore normalcy. A few cousins came back, along with Martha and Robert, who had spent most of the previous day running errands, as they claimed. Ethan didn't believe a word of it. When they sat down at the long oak table, Ethan made sure Thomas had a place at the center. Not in the corner, not at the edge. At the center. Diane watched with thinly veiled irritation, but said nothing. As dishes were passed around, conversation resumed. Shallow, polite, but hollow. People talked about television shows, weather forecasts, and upcoming work schedules. No one addressed attention in the room or the previous night's confrontation. It was as though they had silently agreed to pretend none of it had happened, until Thomas tried to speak. He set his fork down and looked around the table, his voice steady but soft. "I appreciate everyone being here," he said. "It's been a long time since we all sat like this." There was an awkward pause. Lindsay cleared her throat. "Yeah, it's nice. Been a while." Thomas nodded. "Reminds me of when your grandmother used to cook. She'd have the table full by noon." Robert chuckled without humor. "Yeah, but Mom knew how to cook." Ethan stiffened. Thomas didn't seem to notice the jab. He smiled gently, eyes glassy. "She did. She really did." Diane raised her glass. "To Mom." Everyone murmured a half-hearted "to Mom," and the meal continued. But it wasn't long before things soured. When Thomas accidentally knocked over his water glass, the cold liquid spilling across the tablecloth, Martha let out a loud sigh. "Oh, for heaven's sake." "I got it," Ethan said quickly, standing up with a napkin. But Robert was already shaking his head. He doesn't even realize what he's doing anymore. Ethan turned to face him. Yes, he does. It was an accident. He's been slipping for months, Robert replied, not lowering his voice. He forgets things. He repeats himself, and now he's knocking things over. Maybe it's time we stop pretending. Thomas sat quietly, staring at the spilled water, his shoulders drawn inward. Ethan wiped the table quickly, jaw clenched. Maybe it's time we stop treating him like a nuisance, Ethan said. He's confused, Diane said, her tone sharp and intended. We've tried to be patient, but it's exhausting. He's your father, Ethan shot back. That doesn't mean we're equipped to handle everything, Martha added. Do you know how much pressure it is living with someone who doesn't remember if he's eaten or not, or wakes up in the middle of the night, thinking your mom's still alive? Ethan looked at Thomas, who remained silent. He remembers plenty, Ethan said. And even if he didn't, it doesn't give you the right to treat him like this. Jenna spoke from the end of the table. We've been managing the best we can. You just got here, Ethan. You don't know what it's been like. Then tell me, Ethan said. Explain to me why he was sleeping in a guest room instead of the master. Why his clothes are shoved in the hall closet. Why his mail is open before he even sees it. No one answered. Thomas slowly pushed his chair back. I don't want to fight, he said quietly. You're not the one fighting, Ethan said, his voice trembling with controlled anger. You're the one being ignored. Robert stood, tossing his napkin onto the plate. I'm not doing this. You want to play a hero? Go ahead, but don't expect us to follow your script. One by one, the others followed. Chairs scraped. Plates clattered. Within minutes, Ethan and Thomas were alone at the table. I'm sorry, Ethan said softly. You don't need to be, Thomas replied. But Ethan wasn't so sure. The disdain wasn't just passive anymore. It was open, deliberate. They weren't just brushing Thomas aside. They were building a narrative where he no longer belonged. And if that was true, then something deep was going on. Something they were desperate to cover up. Ethan cleared the table alone, washing the dishes in silence while Thomas returned to sunroom. The house felt heavier now, as if every wall was bearing the weight of unspoken truths. That night, Ethan waited until everyone had gone to bed. Then he crept upstairs to the attic, where boxes of old documents and forgotten memories sat gathering dust. With a flashlight in one hand and gloves on the other, he began sorting through the past. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, only that he'd know it when he found it. Dust danced in the narrow beams of Ethan's flashlight as he pushed deeper into the attic. The wooden boards creaked beneath his feet, each step releasing the scent of aged insulation and forgotten seasons. Around him were boxes labeled with dates, names, and faded words like Christmas decorations or kids' art projects. But he wasn't here for nostalgia. He was looking for whatever traces might remain of the version of this family that used to respect a man now ignored downstairs. He spent nearly an hour opening boxes, thumbing through photo albums, and scanning old receipts until he stumbled upon a crate near the back, partially hidden behind an old crib frame and some broken chairs. Unlike the others, this one was unmarked. The lid groaned when he lifted it. Inside were old leather-bound planners, a few manila folders filled with correspondence, and a small metal cash box that had once belonged to his grandfather. The key was still inside. Ethan opened it and found a stack of handwritten notes, utility receipts, and a faded envelope with the bank's name printed across the top. The most recent dated back about 6 months. It was a foreclosure notice. His breath caught. That didn't make sense. The house was paid off, or at least, that's what his Aunt Martha had once told him during a visit 2 years ago. In the same breath, she used to brag about how responsible the family had been with money. But the letter he held now painted a different picture. Ethan dug deeper and found other notices, each more urgent than the last. All of them addressed to Thomas. None of them opened. He sat back on his heels, the flashlight balanced on the edge of the box, casting a tilted light across the papers in his lap. Something was deeply wrong, not just with how the family was treating Thomas emotionally, but financially too. If the house was at risk of being lost, why hadn't anyone said anything? Why weren't they helping him? He returned to his room around 2 o'clock in the morning, the documents bundled tightly under his arm. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he compared the foreclosure letters with the legal correspondence he had found earlier, the one that had clearly been opened before he saw it. Between them, he could tell that someone had been intercepting these notices and keeping them hidden. His mother? Robert? Martha? He wasn't sure yet, but the pattern was unmistakable. By morning, Ethan had made up his mind. He needed to talk to people who had been around longer than the family was willing to admit. He needed a perspective that hadn't been twisted by convenience or guilt. So after breakfast, another quiet meal where no one addressed attention hanging over the table, he announced that he would be out for the day. Running errands? Diane asked, barely looking up from her phone. Something like that, Ethan replied. He didn't take his own car. He took the older sedan that Thomas hadn't driven in years, parked at the edge of the driveway. It still ran, though it smelled of age and mildew. He drove into town and stopped by the local hardware store where his grandfather used to spend entire afternoons chatting with staff. The store had changed owners since, but the older man behind the counter recognized Thomas's name right away. "Oh, sure," the man said, wiping his hands on a rag. He used to come in twice a week. Always bought the same brand of garden gloves. Said the newer ones felt cheap. "You remember when he stopped coming in?" The man frowned. A while after his wife passed, I think, maybe a month or two, said he was taking care of the garden one day, and then just didn't show up again. Ethan nodded, thanked him, and left. His next stop was a house 2 blocks away, a white colonial with blue shutters and a porch swing that had been there for decades. Mrs. Eleanor Beck had been a close friend of his grandmother's and someone Thomas used to visit frequently. She opened the door slowly but smiled when she recognized him. "Ethan Carter," she said. "You're all grown up." He smiled back. "I was hoping you had time for a few questions." She invited him in, offering tea before he could decline. Her home was cozy, the walls covered in photographs and framed embroidery. It smelled of cinnamon and something older like books and time. "I'm worried about Grandpa," he began after some pleasantries. "No one at the house really talks to him anymore. I think he's being pushed out." Mrs. Beck's smile faded. She set her tea down. "That man gave everything to his family. And I mean everything. I believe it. He used to tell me how proud he was, especially of your mother. Said she was strong, stubborn, brilliant. And when your father left, Thomas stepped in, never asked for thanks, just did what needed to be done." "Did he ever talk about money troubles? The house? Anything like that?" She hesitated. "Once, not in detail. He mentioned something about refinancing to help Robert out with debt. Said it was the right thing to do, but I could tell it weighed on him." "Robert never paid him back, did he?" She shook her head. "If he did, Thomas never said so." Ethan sat in silence for a moment, processing. Did he ever say anything about the rest of the family? About how they treated him? Not directly, but he stopped coming around. At first, he'd visit every Sunday, then once a month, and then not at all. I asked him once if everything was okay. He smiled and said, "Everyone's got their own lives now." But his eyes said something different. By the time Ethan left her house, the sun had moved behind thick clouds. He walked back to the car slowly, weighed down by more than just the documents now. It was the stories, the silence, the subtle abandonment that had eaten away at his grandfather's place in the family. This wasn't just a shift in attitude. It was a deliberate erasure. He drove to one final place before heading home, the county records office. It took over an hour, but he eventually located the property file for the house. As he'd feared, there had been multiple refinancing deals on the property, some done years ago with Thomas's signature, but others were more recent, and one of them listed Diane as an authorized party, something that would have required power of attorney. Only Thomas never mentioned giving anyone that. Ethan stood in the fluorescent light of the records room, heart pounding. If what he was looking at was true, then someone in the family had gone behind Thomas's back, legally, financially, and likely with the help of a lawyer who didn't ask too many questions. When he returned to the house late that afternoon, it was quieter than usual. Diane was out, Martha was at work, and Robert's car was gone. Only Jenna was home, lounging on the couch with the television on low volume. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said. "I've been seeing one for a while," Ethan replied. "You all just got used to ignoring him." She frowned, confused, but Ethan didn't explain. He walked past her, straight to the sunroom, where Thomas was napping lightly in the chair by the window. Ethan didn't wake him. He sat in the chair beside him and waited until the old man stirred on his own. When Thomas opened his eyes, he looked at Ethan with the kind of weariness that didn't come from sleep. "I found some letters," Ethan said gently, "and some paperwork. I think there's something going on with the house, with the family. I don't know everything yet, but I'm going to figure it out." Thomas didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I stopped asking questions a long time ago." Ethan leaned forward. "Well, I'm not stopping." Thomas looked at him, something stirring behind his tired gaze. For the first time in days, there was a flicker of something close to hope. And for Ethan, that was enough to keep going. The attic was darker than Ethan remembered. That evening, after everyone had retreated to their usual routines, Jenna to her room, Diane to the kitchen, and the television murmuring through walls, he returned to the cramped space above the second floor. The air was stale, and cobwebs clung to the low beams as if protecting the silence that had lived there for years. He wasn't sure what had drawn him back. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was a feeling that what it already uncovered was just the surface. With a flashlight in one hand and a crowbar in the other, Ethan began prying up a warped wooden plank he'd noticed earlier under the edge of a pile of paint cans. There was a narrow crack along its base, and something about it looked wrong. Too clean compared to the rest of the floorboards, as if it had been tampered with before. The nails came out easier than expected, and after a few minutes of careful lifting, the board gave way. Beneath it, tucked inside a plastic bag and wrapped in a thin towel, was a dusty leather folder. Ethan's pulse quickened. It wasn't labeled. No tape, no tags. Just an age snap button closure and the weight of secrecy in his hands. He carried it downstairs and shut himself in the den, locking the door behind him. There, under the yellow lamplight, he opened the folder. Inside was a neatly arranged stack of documents. The top was a handwritten note, signed by Thomas, dated 5 years earlier. "To whom it may concern, these are the original estate documents, including the full ownership papers for the house at 178 Blackwood Lane, last updated after Evelyn's passing. No changes have been authorized beyond what is filed here. I have retained full legal control over property." Beneath it were copies of the original deed, updated wills, and several notarized affidavits naming Thomas as the sole owner of property. No mention of Diane. No mention of Robert. Certainly no mention of financial agreements involving refinancing or loans tied to the family. Ethan's jaw tightened as he turned each page. These documents completely contradicted the narrative the family had built. If Thomas still had full legal control of the property, then the recent refinancing, with Diane's signature and the claimed power of attorney, had been either forged or fraudulently acquired. And worse, Thomas had no idea it had even happened. Among the last few pages, Ethan found a letter written by Evelyn Carter before her death, a personal letter. She'd written it in trembling cursive, addressed to Thomas but never sent. "I know you'll try to carry everything alone," it read, "but be careful. They love you, but they also see what you have. And sometimes love and need get twisted. Promise me you'll protect yourself. And if you ever feel pushed out, don't leave in silence." The knot in Ethan's stomach returned. He closed the folder and leaned back in the chair, the weight of responsibility now far heavier than before. This wasn't just about neglect or disrespect. This was calculated, hidden, paper trails buried beneath years of manipulation. The next day, Ethan woke earlier than usual and waited for Thomas to rise. When he did, Ethan helped him to the kitchen and set the table for breakfast. "I found something," Ethan said, setting down a cup of tea. "In the attic, hidden under floorboards." Thomas looked up, brows faintly drawn together. "It's your file," Ethan continued. "Your property documents, wills, notes, everything. It proves you still own this house." No one else. You never gave up control. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his hands resting on the ceramic mug. I thought I had lost them, he said softly. I couldn't remember where I put them. You hid them, Ethan said, for a reason. Thomas nodded. I was afraid they'd talk me into something. Or worse, do it without asking. They did. Thomas looked at him, and the tiredness in his eyes deepened. I knew something was wrong, Ethan. I just didn't want to believe it. Ethan leaned in. You don't have to stay silent anymore. Later that afternoon, while the rest of the family was out, Ethan made another visit, this time to a trusted family friend. Roger Bell, a semi-retired attorney who had worked with Thomas in the past. Ethan brought the hidden file with him. Roger studied the documents carefully in his office, brow furrowed the whole time. He didn't speak for nearly half an hour, flipping between papers and cross-referencing the legal language with meticulous focus. When he finally looked up, his expression was grim. This, he said, holding up the updated deed from 5 years ago, is binding. It clearly states Thomas maintained full ownership after his wife's passing. Any legal action taken since, unless he was present or granted someone else power of attorney, would be illegal. What about the refinancing? The foreclosure warnings? The documents I found with Diane's signature? Roger set the folder down. Unless Thomas knowingly granted her control, and there's no evidence here to suggest that, then those documents are fraudulent. At best, forged under misunderstanding. At worst, criminally forged. Ethan sat back in the chair, fists clenched. We need to get ahead of this, Roger said, before they move to sell or transfer anything else. If your mother or uncle are using this property as collateral for personal debts, it's going to spiral. Fast. Can we stop it? Roger nodded. With the right steps, yes. But we need Thomas's consent to file a legal injunction. It might stir things up, likely cause a war in the family, but it would legally freeze the property until we can investigate everything. Ethan didn't hesitate. Do it. That night, Ethan sat beside Thomas again in the sunroom. The old man was quiet, watching the trees sway outside, branches heavy with the weight of the coming season. Do you want to fight this? Ethan asked him. Thomas looked at his grandson. If it means I don't fade away while they carve up what I spent my life building, then yes, I want to fight. Ethan gave him a small nod. Good, because I already started. Thomas exhaled, a slow breath that carried the weight of years unspoken. You know, he said quietly, your grandmother used to say I was too gentle for my own good. Maybe she was right. Ethan shook his head. No, you were trusting. There's a difference. The next morning, the first sign of consequence arrived. A formal letter delivered to the house, addressed to Thomas and bearing the seal of the local courthouse. Jenna found it first, her eyes wide as she handed it to Diane. By the time Ethan entered the room, Diane was reading it aloud, disbelief turning rapidly into anger. What is this? A property freeze? Legal review? Ethan, what did you do? I protected my grandfather, he said plainly. Something none of you were willing to do. You had no right. I had every right, Ethan interrupted. He's still the legal owner of this house. You've been acting like he's in the way, but in reality, you're the one squatting in his life, not the other way around. Robert, who had just walked in, snatched the letter and read it over Diane's shoulder. You're bluffing. There's no way you have that kind of authority. I don't, Ethan said, but he does. He turned to Thomas, who had entered quietly behind him, standing tall despite the slight tremble in his posture. I signed it, Thomas said, with my own hand. This is my house, and I'm taking it back. The room fell into stunned silence. For the first time in years, Thomas Carter had spoken with finality, not confusion, not hesitation, not shame, and no one had the courage to respond. After the legal documents arrived and Thomas stood his ground before the family, the house was never the same. The air inside thickened with suspicion and quiet hostility. Diane barely spoke a word during meals. Robert stopped coming by altogether. Martha, ever the quiet observer, withdrew even more, spending most of her time at her condo in town. Jenna, though still present, watched Ethan with a mixture of confusion and restrained judgment, as if she couldn't decide whether he was saving the family or destroying it from within. But Ethan didn't care about their opinions anymore. The moment Thomas had stepped forward and declared the house his again, Ethan knew there was no going back. Now it was about holding people accountable, uncovering the rest of what had been hidden, and protecting his grandfather not just from neglect, but from calculated betrayal. The first thing he did was meet with Roger again, this time at the lawyer's private office rather than the house. There, behind locked doors and privacy glass, they combed through every bank record, property deed, and legal form Thomas had stored over the years. With Thomas's written consent, Ethan also obtained financial records from a local bank, discovering even more damning inconsistencies. 2 accounts had been opened under Thomas's name without his direct knowledge. One of them, created 4 years ago, showed monthly withdrawals that aligned almost exactly with the timeline Robert's construction business had nearly gone under. Another account showed auto payments set up for a second mortgage that Thomas never approved, one used to fund a renovation at Diane's house in Ridgefield. Ethan confirmed the project through county permit records. The contractor listed was the same firm Robert occasionally used. The connections were no longer assumptions. They were documented, traceable, and illegal. But evidence alone wouldn't be enough. Ethan needed to build a record, something undeniable. So he began to record conversations in the house, not in secret, but openly, after informing Thomas and securing written permission for legal purposes. He set up a small audio device in the sunroom and carried a voice recorder in his pocket during family interactions. Most conversations were mundane, laced with passive aggression and avoidance. But occasionally, the truth slipped through in carelessly spoken words. Like when Diane muttered during dinner, "He wouldn't even know what to do with this house anymore. We were the ones keeping afloat." Or when Robert returned one evening, unaware of the recorder tucked beneath the hallway table, and whispered to Diane in the kitchen, "If he pushes this to court, we'll all go under. You signed that loan using his name, remember? That alone could land us in prison." Ethan copied the audio files to an encrypted drive. He backed up everything twice, once to his laptop, and once to a cloud account only he could access. Every step was calculated, every document labeled and cross-referenced. It wasn't just about building a case for legal protection. It was about proving beyond doubt that Thomas Carter had been systematically manipulated by the very people who claimed to be protecting him. But amidst all the quiet maneuvering, there were still moments of softness, slivers of what the family used to be. One night, while Ethan and Thomas sat in the sunroom, Thomas spoke without being prompted. "Did you think they ever really loved me?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the darkened garden beyond the glass. Ethan didn't rush to answer. "I think they love what you gave them. And maybe, somewhere inside all of this, they forgot to love you for who you are." Thomas nodded slowly. "I used to believe love was shown through sacrifice. You give, and they know. But now I wonder if I gave them too much." "You gave them more than they ever earned," Ethan said. They sat in silence for a while, watching as wind rustled the tall grass and the last of the autumn leaves blew past the porch. The next step Ethan took was speaking to the neighbors. Mr. and Mrs. Langford, who lived across the street, had known the Carters for over 30 years. When Ethan approached them, they welcomed him with wary curiosity. Over cups of coffee in their living room, he asked them directly if they had noticed anything unusual over the past few years. Mrs. Langford was the first to respond. "I used to see your grandfather in the yard almost every morning. Then one day, nothing, just gone. No explanation." Her husband nodded. "We asked your aunt once, Martha, I think, what happened. She said Thomas was resting more these days. But we could tell something wasn't right. We even tried calling once or twice. No answer. After a while, we figured they wanted space." Ethan explained what he had discovered, and the Langfords listened intently, clearly disturbed. When he asked if they'd be willing to provide statements, just to confirm the timeline of events, they agreed without hesitation. Back at the house, tension reached a boiling point by the end of the week. Diane confronted Ethan in the kitchen after another formal notice from the attorney arrived by courier. "You're destroying this family," she hissed, slamming the envelope onto the counter. "Whatever fantasy you have about saving Dad, it's coming at the cost of everything we've built." "What you've built," Ethan replied, "was on a foundation of deception. He wouldn't even be here without us." "He wouldn't be broke if not for you," Ethan countered. "You drained his accounts. You put his house at risk. And now you're angry because someone stood up to stop it." Diane's face went pale. "You don't understand the pressure I've been under. Do you think raising 2 kids alone was easy? Do you think any of us had options?" "You had him," Ethan said, "and instead of protecting him, you used him." That night, Ethan packed a small suitcase for Thomas. He'd found a temporary apartment nearby, just a 1-bedroom in a quiet complex with elevator access and a community garden. It wasn't permanent, but it was safe. He'd made the decision after catching Robert walking through Thomas's room unannounced earlier that day, pretending to look for an old photo album. Ethan knew better. The man was looking for more documents. When Ethan told Thomas about the move, the old man didn't resist. He simply asked, "Will I still see you every day?" "Every day," Ethan promised. They left without fanfare. No one said goodbye. Diane stayed in her room. Jenna didn't come downstairs. And Robert was conveniently at the office. As Ethan drove them to the new apartment, Thomas looked out the window in silence. "You did the right thing," Ethan said softly. "I don't feel right," Thomas murmured. "I feel removed." "You're not removed," Ethan said. "You're free." When they arrived, Thomas took his time walking through the apartment, touching the counter, the armrest of the recliner, the window pane. It was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that weighed on him. It was restful. He sat down slowly, exhaled, and closed his eyes. Ethan watched him for a moment before stepping onto the balcony to take a call. Roger was on the line. "We're almost ready," Roger said. "We've compiled enough evidence to move forward with full guardianship transfer. Once it's filed, they won't be able to touch him or his assets again." "And after that?" Ethan asked. "Then we prepare for what comes next. Civil suits. Potential criminal investigation. It's not over yet." "I know," Ethan said, "but at least he's safe now." As he hung up, Ethan looked out over the neighborhood. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting a soft gold over the rooftops. For the first time since arriving in Connecticut, he felt the edges of peace return. Not victory, not closure, but protection. And that was enough to keep fighting. The apartment had grown into a sanctuary. Within a week of moving in, Thomas began to show subtle signs of recovery. He wasn't the same as he'd been 10 years ago, nor would he ever be, but his mind seemed clearer now, his voice steadier. He asked about the garden behind the complex, showed interest in organizing his books, even took brief walks down the hallway with Ethan's arm gently guiding him. The blank stares that had once haunted his expression were beginning to fade. Ethan suspected it had less to do with medical change and more to do with something far simpler: dignity. The silence of their days was no longer hollow, but peaceful. Meals were shared, stories were told, and for the first time in years, Thomas was spoken of rather than around. But peace, Ethan knew, was a temporary thing. Roger had filed a guardianship request with the county court. It was a clean case, well documented and supported by testimony, but no legal procedure involving family ever unfolded quietly. The rest of the family had remained mostly silent since Thomas's departure from the house. Ethan hadn't heard a word from Diane or Jenna in nearly a week. Even Robert, who usually couldn't resist sending a passive-aggressive email or vague legal threat, had gone dark. That kind of silence wasn't surrender. It was a calm before another storm. The storm arrived in the form of a hastily planned family dinner. Diane called Ethan directly. "I want to talk," she said. "Face to face. All of us." "Why now?" Ethan asked. "Because we've all had time to think. And because this family is falling apart." Ethan hesitated, unsure whether this was a trap or a genuine moment of reckoning. If this is about guilt-tripping Grandpa into dropping the case. "It's not," she interrupted. "Just come. Please." Ethan didn't give her an answer right away, but after discussing it with Thomas, he agreed to go, on the condition that Thomas would not attend. The old man had no interest in confronting the people who had already made their disdain so clear. He'd said his piece. Now it was Ethan's turn. When Ethan arrived at the house, the scent of overcooked meat and store-bought dessert greeted him at the door. The dining table was set with a polished intensity that made everything feel staged. Diane stood at the head of the table. Martha sat quietly at one end. Jenna stared at her phone. Robert was already half a drink in, his tie loose and his mouth twitching with irritation. Ethan didn't sit right away. He scanned the room. So who's going to start? Diane motioned to the seat next to her. Please. He sat, keeping his expression unreadable. Diane folded her hands in front of her. We've been talking, and we agree this has gone too far. What exactly has gone too far? Ethan asked, taking responsibility? Defending someone who can't defend himself. You're twisting this, Robert said. You think we planned all of it, that we're criminals. I don't think, Ethan replied. I have documents, audio, financial records, signatures that don't match, forged applications, and a legal declaration from Grandpa. Robert leaned forward. Then sue us, if that's what you want. I don't want a lawsuit, Ethan said. I want honesty. Diane's voice softened. We were trying to protect him. By cutting him out of his own life? Ethan asked. By isolating him in the corner of a house he paid for? By draining his accounts while telling him it was all under control? We didn't drain anything, Martha said quietly. We just made adjustments, temporary ones, which you never told him about. Diane's facade cracked. He wouldn't have understood. You think he's sharp, but he's not. Not anymore. He forgets things. He gets lost in old memories. Because he was made to feel irrelevant. You didn't give him a reason to stay engaged. He was slipping, Jenna finally said, and it scared us. It made everything harder. We didn't know what to do. So you ignored him, Ethan said. You blamed him for your discomfort. We didn't sign up to be caretakers, Diane snapped. Ethan's voice lowered. You didn't sign up to steal from him either, but you did that too. The silence that followed was deep and tense. Robert stood abruptly, pushing back from the table. You want us to say we're monsters? Fine, maybe we are, but we also kept this family running when everything fell apart. We paid bills. We made decisions. And we did what we thought was best. No, Ethan said. You did what was easiest. And now it's over. Diane's face was flushed with heat. What happens now, Ethan? You parade him around like a trophy? You win the moral high ground and we all lose. No one had to lose, Ethan said. But you made that choice. Jenna's voice was small now. He'll never forgive us. Maybe not, Ethan said. But I hope someday you'll understand why he shouldn't. He stood. I didn't come here for closure. I came to tell you this. The guardianship is moving forward. He's safe. His assets are secured. And if you try to interfere again, legally or otherwise, you'll be dealing with more than just me. You'll be dealing with the law. Martha stood too, but didn't speak. She just gave him a long, sorrowful look. Diane's hands trembled as she tried to lift her wine glass, but gave up halfway. Robert didn't move. Jenna stared down at the placemat like it could offer her absolution. Ethan walked to the door. Before stepping out, he turned back. It didn't have to be this way. No one responded. Back at the apartment, Thomas was still awake, seated in his armchair with a blanket over his legs and a small book open in his lap. He looked up as Ethan entered. You went, he said simply. Ethan nodded, setting his coat on the hook. They won't come near you again. Thomas closed the book. I never wanted it to end this way. I know, Ethan said, taking the seat across from him. But they left you no other option. Thomas sighed. There was a time when I would have forgiven them without question. A time when I would have believed their excuses. And now, Thomas looked at Ethan. Now I know the cost of silence. Ethan leaned back in the chair, his shoulders finally relaxing. The final line had been drawn. The family had made their position clear. And so had he. In the quiet that followed, Thomas spoke again. You've done more for me in the past month than anyone else has in years. Ethan smiled faintly. I'm just making sure you're seen. You deserve that. Thomas looked at him with something between gratitude and grief. I only wish it hadn't taken so long. Ethan didn't reply. He didn't need to, because from here on out, time would no longer be spent waiting for love or respect. It would be spent living, with dignity restored and silence broken. The small apartment glowed with the mellow light of evening as Ethan and Thomas shared dinner, a modest meal, but rich with presence. The shuffling calm of their routine contrasted sharply with the distortion and cruelty that unfolded back at the family home. Yet, a part of Ethan's mind remained unsettled. Guardianship might shield Thomas and the property, but it didn't uncover motive nor fully restore what had been lost. It was time to connect the fractured dots, not to punish, but to tell the whole, true story. Early the next morning, Ethan called Mrs. Beck, the elderly neighbor and friend of both Thomas and his late wife, Evelyn. He invited her over with the pretext of biscuits and tea. When she arrived, Ethan carefully laid out the documents, the affidavits, and several photographs from the attic, images of Thomas's strength and centrality in family life, of the house in better times, of Evelyn smiling beside her husband. Mrs. Beck's eyes filled with tears as she flipped through memories. He was never someone complained, she said quietly, sipping the tea. So when things changed, no one knew how to help. They thought distance was easier than caring loudly. Ethan nodded. It was more than wistful regret. It was an admission that compassion had failed, drowned out by fear and avoidance. Mrs. Beck agreed to be a witness, ready to testify to the change in family dynamics, the decline in Thomas's involvement, and how the household had subtly, almost invisibly, shifted away from him. She didn't speak ill of anyone, but her recollections carried weight. Next, Ethan revisited the Langfords. He brought documentation, photographs from the garden, receipts, older correspondence, anything that corroborated the timeline of Thomas becoming isolated. Mr. Langford examined letters from his mailbox, dated months apart, addressed to Thomas and often tossed by staff at the house before reaching him. Mrs. Langford recalled seeing a stack of letters near the mail slot gathering dust, or being rifled through at odd times. Their memory of those details helped Ethan weave the story of deliberate omission that had gone on for far too long. By afternoon, Ethan returned to Roger's office. Together, they drafted a memorandum not just focused on guardianship, but on restitution, truth, and legacy. The talks shifted to possible civil actions, recovering stolen funds and rectifying forged documents. But more importantly, it included a plan for a community event honoring Thomas's contributions, not to humiliate the family, but to reclaim the dignity that had been quietly dismantled. Roger cautioned that the case might lead to an extended legal battle. Diane and Robert could countersue, contest documents, question mental capacity. But with the case solid, the hidden files, the notarized declarations, and neighbor testimonies, they had material that was rare and compelling. As afternoon light dimmed, Ethan and Thomas sat in the sunroom. The space felt anchored now, a pivot between past and future. He told Thomas about the discussions in the office, the plans being made, the restitution, the recognition. Thomas listened, eyes tired but attentive, face coming back into focus, shaped with unspoken gratitude. Then, over the coming days, Ethan set out to better understand, not just the courtroom, but for himself, the lives of each family member beyond the convenient facade they presented. He visited Robert's construction business. Quiet, dusty, underfunded. He learned how Robert's finances had spiraled years ago, how he'd leaned on family loans, and then moved to more aggressive extraction. From a neighbor, he found out how late-night conversations between Diane and Robert happened in hushed tones, often while Thomas slept, discussing the house, getting things handled. It was subtle, relentless dismantling, financially and emotionally. Jenna, torn and isolated, agreed to meet briefly in a coffee shop removed from home. She admitted, voice trembling, that she'd always loved her grandfather. But the tension, the money troubles, the pride, all had made it harder to speak up. I thought it would pass, she said, tears catching. I thought if I ignored him long enough, it wouldn't be so awkward. Ethan reached across the table and held her hand, forgiveness already in his heart. With each new piece of the mosaic, the picture grew sharper. A man sidelined, a home usurped, silence weaponized. Yet amid that erosion, small moment of tenderness persisted. Thomas watering his own garden when he could, greeting neighbors with small kindnesses, telling stories of Evelyn without bitterness. Ethan organized all these threads. In the weeks that followed, Roger filed several motions, some to recover assets, some to bar Diane and Robert from managing Thomas's finances, others to request compensation for emotional distress. Each filing came with fresh supporting documentation. Copies of forged documents, affidavits from neighbors and friends, recordings from a house where family members spoke with careless honesty. One filing proposed a public ceremony to celebrate Thomas. Roger explained that while it's unusual in legal proceedings, it served both restorative and symbolic functions, returning not just legal control, but human recognition and community memory. Before the hearing dates, Ethan and Thomas prepared together. The old man practiced phrases, clear, confident statements affirming ownership of the house and his feelings of betrayal. His voice was steadier now. He wasn't ashamed anymore, just resolved. When the day finally came, the courtroom was muted, hushed in contrast to the quiet fury that had preceded it. The filings were presented, witnesses called. Mrs. Beck testified to Thomas's shifting role, the Langfords to the steady decline of his engagement. Roger articulated the fraud in legal language, overwhelming in its precision. At one point, Diane and Robert were called to describe Thomas's condition and explain their actions. Their voices cracked under scrutiny. Words faltered. The image of caring for him cracked to reveal the erosion behind it. But when Thomas stood, supported by Ethan's hand, he spoke calmly, clearly with dignity. "I love this family," he said. "I still hope for them. But someone needed to be here for me when no one else would be." The judge, a stern, fair woman, closed the hearing with empathy. She reaffirmed guardianship, ordered restitution, and approved the public ceremony to be held in the town's civic hall. She noted that, although the family wasn't criminally charged, the court viewed the findings as deeply troubling and encouraged reconciliation and restitution. When Ethan and Thomas walked out, the air seemed lighter, softer. Outside the courthouse, friends and townspeople greeted them. Mrs. Beck offered a bouquet of daisies. The Langfords hugged them both, tears glinting in their eyes. In the coming days, the small ceremony unfolded with quiet beauty. The room was full, neighbors, old friends, even some family members who stood in the back. A local pastor spoke about legacy, love, and justice. Thomas listened, and when his grandson presented him a small plaque, in honor of Thomas Carter, a man of love, strength, and unwavering heart, the applause wasn't for victory, but for recognition. His shoulders uncurled in that moment. His eyes cleared. That night, back in the apartment, Ethan watched Thomas drift into sleep in his favorite chair. The fight was far from over. Rebuilding trust would take forever. But for now, dignity had flowed home again. And while the rest of the story still needed its healing, the central chapter had finally been written, with all the necessary truth intact. It was just past 10 o'clock at night when the cough began. Ethan had just stepped out of the shower, wrapped in a towel, steam still clinging to the bathroom mirror, when he heard it, dry, strained, coming from the living room. Not unusual in itself. Thomas had developed a slight rasp over the past few weeks, but this was different. It didn't stop. It sounded like something was caught too deep for a sip of water to fix. Ethan rushed into the room. Thomas was slumped forward on the couch, one hand gripping the armrest, the other pressed to his chest. His face was pale, the color drained like someone had unplugged him from the world. Ethan dropped the towel and ran to his side, kneeling, trying to assess whether it was a heart attack, a panic attack, or something else entirely. "Grandpa, can you breathe?" Thomas nodded barely, but couldn't speak. The cough was relentless, shaking his thin frame with each spasm. Ethan steadied him, grabbed the water on the table, and helped him sip, but even that triggered another round. "I'm calling someone," Ethan said, already reaching for his phone. Thomas's hand shot up weakly, grabbing Ethan's wrist with what strength he had. No hospital," he whispered. Ethan's jaw tightened. You need help. I'll call the nurse line. No hospital, Thomas repeated. Ethan nodded, dialing an after-hours home care service. He gave the operator the necessary details, age, symptoms, history, while keeping one hand on his grandfather's shoulder. Within 20 minutes, a nurse arrived, calm and professional. She checked vitals, monitored the cough, and gave Thomas something to help suppress the spasms. It worked gradually, easing him into a more stable condition. But the incident shook Ethan, not just because of the physical scare. It was something deeper, a realization. Time was no longer a slow-burning threat. It was now present, immediate. The frailty he'd tried to buffer Thomas from was real. It wasn't about fear anymore. It was about responsibility. After the nurse left, Ethan sat beside the now sleeping Thomas, staring at the dark window, watching the streetlights flicker. That's when he made the call, not to a hospital, not to the family, but to someone he'd been holding off on contacting for days. "Hi," he said when the voice answered. "My name is Ethan Carter. I'm calling about elder protection representation. I'd like to start the process for full guardianship." The lawyer on the other end, Angela Monroe, was calm, professional, and quick to ask questions. Ethan answered all of them: age, history, current condition, recent incidents, financial manipulation, the legal documents already filed, and the family's resistance. Angela listened intently, pausing only to ask about the timeline and whether Thomas could still legally consent. "He can," Ethan said, "but I don't know for how long. He's lucid, but I don't want to wait until he isn't." Angela agreed. She scheduled a formal in-home assessment for the following morning, warning that the family would be notified once the case was entered into the court system. Ethan thanked her and ended the call. The moment the call disconnected, the reality of what he'd done settled in. There would be no hiding from this. The family would be alerted. The lines would be drawn permanently. This wasn't just protecting Thomas anymore. It was a declaration of war. The next morning arrived gray and cold. Angela Monroe showed up precisely at 8 o'clock. She was younger than Ethan expected, mid-30s, sharply dressed, with a briefcase and a tone that balanced warmth and firmness. She greeted Thomas like an old friend, not a client, asking him about his life, his thoughts, his memories, and, delicately, his fears. Thomas responded carefully, his voice weak but clear. He spoke of his wife, the family gatherings of years past, his days in the garden, and then, with shift in tone, the day he realized no one was listening to him anymore. "I knew something had changed," he said, "when they stopped asking me questions, when they only spoke to each other. I felt like I was just a shadow in my own house." Angela didn't interrupt. She nodded, scribbled notes, and occasionally looked at Ethan to fill in details. By the end of the interview, she had what she needed. "He's competent," she said later, outside the apartment door. "But this can't wait. I'll file the emergency guardianship petition today. Once it's approved, you'll have legal authority over his care, finances, and living arrangements. And the family? They'll be notified within 48 hours, she said, and they'll have the option to contest it. But based on what you've shown me, I doubt they'll have grounds to win." Ethan thanked her again. He watched her leave, then returned inside, where Thomas had dozed off once more. He felt the ache again, of gratitude, of guilt, of fierce loyalty. He was doing everything right, and yet it all felt too late, like he was trying to repair something decades in the making. Exactly 43 hours later, the notifications were delivered to each family member. Diane received hers first. She was in her kitchen when the courier handed her the envelope. She read it once, then again, her face going white, hands trembling with rage. Robert called Ethan an hour later. "You've lost your mind," he snapped through the phone. "You think a few papers and some sentimental garbage is going to rewrite the truth?" "No," Ethan said. "It's going to reveal it. You're not family anymore." "Then I guess I'm exactly where I should be." He hung up. The backlash began almost immediately. Diane emailed Roger, threatening to expose Ethan for manipulating an elderly man under duress. Jenna sent a long, tear-filled voicemail accusing Ethan of dividing what little family they had left. Martha, more cautious, sent a short message asking to talk soon, perhaps already preparing to distance herself from the rest. None of it changed anything. The guardianship was granted 2 days later. Ethan received the confirmation via email signed by the judge. It was official. He was now the sole legal guardian of Thomas Carter, with full authority to manage all affairs related to health, property, and finances. Angela congratulated him and offered to continue representing them through any civil matters ahead. When Ethan told Thomas the news, the old man simply nodded. "I trust you," he said. "That's all that matters." The word struck Ethan more than any threat or complaint from the others. Trust wasn't a given. It was something sacred, especially from someone who'd been betrayed so thoroughly. And now it was his to carry. The next morning, Ethan returned to the house, not to confront the family, but to collect Thomas's remaining belongings. He arrived with boxes, a moving truck, and a lock change notice authorized by the court. Diane tried to bar the door. Ethan presented the legal documents. Robert threatened to call the police. Ethan handed over the judge's ruling. By midday, the house was quiet again. He packed the last of the photo albums, Thomas's clothes, a few keepsakes left to gather dust in closets. As he walked through the rooms, once filled with voices, now heavy with resentment, he realized that he didn't feel victory. He felt clarity. And that was enough. The legal confirmation of guardianship arrived like a gavel dropped in the center of a long, simmering argument, sudden, irreversible, and deafening. Though Ethan expected retaliation, he underestimated the speed and venom with which the backlash would arrive. The official notice hadn't been in the family's hands for more than a day when the first countermotion was filed. Not by Robert or Diane, but surprisingly by Jenna. Ethan received the news via an alert from Roger's office. Petition to challenge guardianship filed by Jenna Carter. Claims coercion and undue influence. Court date pending. Staring at the notification, Ethan didn't feel anger. He felt weariness. He had believed, naively perhaps, that Jenna was the most likely to come around. But instead, she'd chosen to stand behind the crumbling facade the others were desperately trying to protect. Roger responded swiftly. He filed an opposition brief with clear, annotated documentation. The audio recordings, notarized statements from neighbors and friends, the history of financial irregularities, and most important, Thomas's own recorded statements, made during lucid moments, where he clearly outlined his wishes and recalled his mistreatment. It was a legal wall Jenna would struggle to climb, but that didn't mean the battle would be short. The days that followed were filled with new layers of hostility. Diane began a campaign of reputation erosion, whispering to mutual acquaintances in town that Ethan had manipulated Thomas for control of the estate. Robert took a more aggressive route, publishing a long, vague rant on his business website about being betrayed by blood and facing legal extortion by a young man with too much time and too little loyalty. The post was quickly removed, but not before screenshots made their way to local discussion forums. Ethan ignored the noise. He focused on what mattered. Thomas, despite the turmoil, was doing better. He was eating full meals again, participating in small community events at the apartment complex, and even began keeping a journal, encouraged by Ethan and their elder care social worker. His handwriting was shaky, his entries sometimes repetitive, but the act of writing gave him purpose. One evening, he read a passage aloud to Ethan. "I do not miss the house. I miss what it was, before silence filled the walls, before my name became an interruption." Ethan listened in silence, his chest tightening with each word. There was no resentment in Thomas's tone, only release. But the storm swirled on outside. At a mandatory pre-trial meeting, Roger and Ethan faced Jenna and her attorney for the first time since the filing. The conference room was neutral, sterile, and filled with a tension that barely remained under the surface. Jenna wore a blazer she clearly borrowed from Diane. Her expression flickered between defiance and doubt. Her lawyer, a man named Caldwell, was professional but overconfident. "We believe Mr. Carter is not a sound mind," Caldwell began, "and that he's been unduly influenced by Mr. Ethan Carter for personal gain." Roger didn't flinch. "We have medical evaluations dated within the last 3 weeks confirming Mr. Carter's cognitive capacity. We also have over 5 hours of recorded interviews in which he states his desire to remain under Ethan Carter's care." We're happy to provide transcripts. Caldwell leaned forward. Your client is 84 years old. The likelihood of memory manipulation is significant. Thomas Carter is 83, Roger corrected. And the only manipulation in this case came from the people who filed credit applications in his name and forged his signature on refinancing contracts. Jenna shifted uncomfortably. The meeting concluded with no agreement, meaning the court hearing would proceed. Roger informed Ethan later that they were likely to win, but warned him that families under legal pressure often lashed out in personal ways when institutional routes failed. And that prediction came true just 3 days later. Someone, Ethan never learned who, called the Adult Protective Services hotline anonymously, alleging that Ethan was isolating Thomas, controlling his finances, and denying him medical care. An investigation was automatically triggered. 2 caseworkers showed up at the apartment unannounced. Thomas was in his recliner, watching an old Western when they arrived. Ethan invited them in calmly and cooperated fully. He provided medical records, copies of the guardianship, and even the medication logs maintained by the home nurse. The caseworkers interviewed Thomas privately for over an hour. When they left, one of them paused at the door. Off the record, she said quietly, "We've seen real abuse before. This isn't it." Still, the emotional toll was real. Ethan sat on the balcony that night, overlooking the parking lot, staring at the lights of passing cars. He wasn't angry at the report. He was exhausted. The family wasn't trying to win. They were trying to wear him down, hoping he'd quit, collapse, give up the fight, and return Thomas to the indifferent care of the past. But that wouldn't happen. The next morning, he doubled his efforts. He hired a second legal assistant to help Roger's team manage the mounting paperwork. He documented every interaction with the family, every visit, every conversation. He even installed an extra security system in the apartment at Roger's suggestion. If the family planned to undermine him, they would have to do it through lies. And lies, Ethan was learning, were fragile under pressure. Thomas continued to stabilize. He spent his afternoons in the apartment's garden, helped by a volunteer named Linda, who had taken a special interest in his care. They planted rosemary and thyme together, small herbs, easy to manage, but symbolic. Evelyn used to love fresh herbs, Thomas told her one morning. She said they made every meal feel like a memory. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the building and cast long shadows across the floor, Thomas turned to Ethan and asked, "Do you think they'll ever see what they did?" Ethan thought for a moment. Maybe not. Some people refuse to look backward. "I wish I'd said something sooner," Thomas said. "I should have spoken up. When they first started making decisions without asking. When I stopped being invited to dinners. I stayed silent, hoping they'd come back to me. They chose not to," Ethan said. "That's not on you." "But maybe if I fought harder," Thomas whispered, "maybe I wouldn't have needed you to save me." Ethan shook his head. "You didn't need saving. You needed someone to remember who you are." At the final pre-trial hearing, the judge reviewed both Ethan's petition and the counterclaims presented by Jenna. After reviewing all materials and testimonies, the judge ruled in Ethan's favor. Jenna's challenge was dismissed with prejudice. The guardianship remained intact. Legal warnings were issued to the other family members for potential financial misconduct. Civil suits would follow. As the courtroom emptied, Jenna avoided Ethan's gaze. She left quickly, disappearing into the corridor. Diane was not present. Neither was Robert. Outside, Thomas sat in the car, bundled in his coat, waiting. Ethan climbed into the driver's seat and looked over at him. "It's done," he said. Thomas gave a quiet nod. "Then let's go home." The following week unfolded like a gentle unraveling of tension, one stitch at a time. For the first time in what felt like years, Thomas Carter's days were not filled with the gnawing sensation of being in someone's way. The court case was behind them, the civil suit still pending, but now in the capable hands of Roger's expanding legal team. The noise had quieted. What remained was a soft cadence of healing. The apartment no longer felt temporary. Ethan, though he hadn't planned on staying long, found himself extending his lease. His job in Boston had been placed on hold indefinitely, and his supervisor sympathetic after hearing the full context, had granted him an unpaid leave with a promise of return when he was ready. That freedom gave him the time and space to rebuild a life not just for Thomas, but for both of them. Mornings began early. Thomas insisted on waking by 6 o'clock, a habit ingrained from decades of hard work. Ethan would brew coffee while Thomas reviewed his growing notebook of daily thoughts and memories, which now included small sketches, flowers, birds, outlines of the house he no longer called home. He seemed lighter somehow. The fog in his expression had cleared, not entirely, but enough that his eyes once again held curiosity. One morning, Thomas surprised Ethan by bringing up the old shed in the backyard of the house they'd left behind. "I used to keep a box of seeds there," he said. "From Evelyn's garden. She saved everything, even when the soil stopped listening." "You want to go back for them?" Ethan asked carefully. Thomas shook his head. "No, but I'd like to plant something new. Here, for her." Later that week, with help from Linda, the same volunteer who becomes something of a guardian angel, they tilled a small patch of dirt in the shared garden behind the apartment complex. The soil was shallow, but fertile enough for herbs and flowers. Thomas chose lavender and marigold. "She loved the colors," he said, gently placing each seed with reverence. It was more than gardening. It was remembrance without regret. Their new normal brought unexpected visitors too. Mrs. Beck came by every few days with warm bread or homemade soup, sometimes staying for long chats, sometimes just offering quiet company. The Langfords visited once too, bringing an old photograph they'd found, Ethan as a child on Thomas's shoulders, reaching for a paper kite stuck in a tree. That picture now sat framed on the small bookshelf in the living room, beside a stack of Evelyn's old books. But not all connections were simple. One afternoon, Jenna called. Her voice was cautious, apologetic without explicitly saying so. "I've been thinking," she said, "about everything. About you, about Grandpa." Ethan stayed quiet, letting her speak. "I was scared and ashamed. I think I still am." "Shame only matters if it leads to change," Ethan replied. "I want to visit," she said, "if that's okay." Ethan agreed, but made it clear that Thomas would set the terms. The visit happened 2 days later. Jen arrived carrying a photo album and a small tray of lemon bars, Evelyn's recipe, though clearly store-bought. Thomas greeted her with quiet civility, nothing more. But as she flipped through the album, pointing out moments she'd forgotten, moments Thomas remembered vividly, a fragile bridge began to form. "I should have stood up for you," she said at one point. "I let them silence you." Thomas didn't respond immediately. He tapped the photo of a family picnic, his younger self holding Evelyn's hand. "You don't fix the past," he said. "You plant something better and wait for it to grow." Jenna returned to her car in tears, but promised to come back. Whether she would or not remained to be seen. Thomas had accepted her visit without expectation, the way one accepts sunlight on a cloudy day, grateful but not dependent. Meanwhile, Ethan met with Roger to discuss next steps for the civil cases. Diane and Robert had retained separate attorneys, both aggressively denying wrongdoing, but the paper trail was long and undeniable. Roger was confident they'd settle before the court date. "The real damage isn't legal," Roger said. "It's relational. They lost the right to call themselves his caretakers. That's a scar they'll carry longer than a fine." Ethan nodded, though part of him wished they'd carry something heavier. Outside of court, Ethan began reintegrating pieces of his life that had fallen away during the chaos. He reconnected with old friends via video calls, began working part-time remotely, and even joined a writing group in town. Inspired by Thomas's journals, he started documenting everything, the story from his own eyes, not as a crusade, but as a legacy. "I don't want them to forget," he told Thomas one evening. "And I don't want others to pretend this doesn't happen." Thomas only smiled. "Then tell it right, and don't leave the soft parts out." Their routine developed a rhythm. Thursdays were market days. Saturdays, coffee and crossword puzzles. Sunday evenings, they watched old movies, mostly black and white westerns or screwball comedies. Thomas always laughed at the same scenes, even when he forgot the names of the actors. The apartment filled with life in ways the old house hadn't for years. One day, Ethan found Thomas asleep in the sunroom, Evelyn's worn shawl folded neatly in his lap, a photo of their wedding tucked beside him on the chair. Ethan didn't wake him. He sat silently and read from one of Thomas's notebooks. On the last page, written in thin, careful handwriting, was a sentence that made Ethan pause. A man only loses everything when he forgets he was loved. Ethan read it twice, then closed the notebook. He looked at his grandfather, peaceful in sleep, and knew those words were a mirror. The story wasn't about loss. It was about remembering and being remembered. In the background, the herbs they'd planted began to sprout. Small green stems pushed through the dirt, reaching toward the sun. It was the beginning of something new. Not perfect, but honest. It was a Wednesday morning in late spring when the official invitation arrived. Printed on thick ivory stock, embossed with the seal of the town council. The envelope bore Ethan's name, but the contents were meant for someone else. Inside was a formal request. The community of Blackwood invites Mr. Thomas Carter to a special recognition ceremony in honor of his contributions to the town's legacy and intergenerational service. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, the letter open in front of him, and looked across the room at his grandfather, who was quietly folding laundry with the same methodical care he'd used for everything in life. There was a time when such a moment would have been unthinkable, a ceremony, a public acknowledgement, even a suggestion of respect from a town that had watched Thomas fade into the background. But everything had changed. Ethan cleared his throat. "Grandpa?" Thomas looked up, eyes bright under the soft morning light. "You've been invited to a ceremony next month. The town want to honor you. Formally. Speeches, photos, the whole thing." Thomas set down the towel in his hands and leaned back in his chair. "That sounds like a lot of fuss." "It's not fuss," Ethan said. "It's overdue." They didn't speak of it again for several days. But the letter remained on the counter, visible and untouched, like a door left open but not yet walked through. Then, one evening, Thomas approached Ethan while he was reading by the window. "I'll go," he said simply. "But I don't want them dressing it up like a eulogy. I'm not done yet." Ethan smiled. "I'll make sure of that." The weeks leading up to the event were filled with preparations, not just for the ceremony, but for the lives they were still building. Thomas had become a local figure again, not because of scandal or legal spectacle, but because people had started to talk about his resilience, about what had happened, about what it meant. Linda arranged for a group of neighborhood kids to help maintain the garden. They came on weekends with gloves too big for their hands and faces smudged with dirt, eager to learn how to plant and prune. Thomas taught them the same way he'd taught Ethan years ago, with patience and gentle correction. When the boys asked once, "Did you always live here?" Thomas chuckled. "No, but I found home here." Meanwhile, the civil suits moved forward. Diane and Robert both settled out of court, agreeing to repay funds withdrawn from Thomas's accounts and signing statements acknowledging their misuse of power. Ethan never celebrated the settlements. There was no victory in watching people unravel their own decency, but it did close a chapter and ensure that Thomas would never again be treated as an afterthought. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and cool. Ethan helped Thomas dress, a crisp white shirt, navy blazer, and the same tie he'd worn at Evelyn's memorial service. It wasn't about grief today. It was about presence, about being seen. The town hall had been decorated simply, with local flowers and framed photos from Thomas's life, many of which Ethan had provided. A local historian opened the event, recounting Thomas's decades of quiet service, a volunteer during flooding, a mentor to local teens, a caretaker of public spaces, and a man who, though never loud, had shaped the town's moral architecture with his steadiness. Several people spoke, including Mrs. Beck and Mr. Langford. They told stories of community barbecues, of late-night conversations, of gardens resurrected from frost. Jenna stood too, her voice trembling as she described her grandfather's unwavering kindness, even after she failed to extend it in return. "I lost my way," she said, "but he never held it against me. That kind of grace is rare, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." Finally, Ethan stepped up to the podium. He didn't bring notes. He didn't need them. "My grandfather taught me what legacy really means. Not money, not property, but love in action, honor in silence, dignity in the face of abandonment. He showed me that being forgotten doesn't mean being invisible, and that speaking up for someone isn't a duty. It's a privilege. When Thomas was called to the stage, he moved slowly but without help. He looked out at the crowd, not large but genuine, and took a breath. "I don't have fancy words," he said. "I've lived a quiet life. I made mistakes. I trusted too easily. But I also loved deeply. And I never stopped believing that people could change. That includes me." Applause followed, long and heartfelt. That evening, back at the apartment, Ethan and Thomas sat in the garden. The lavender was in full bloom. A soft breeze carried the scent through the air. "That was a lot," Thomas said, sipping tea. "You did good," Ethan replied. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun drift lower. Then Thomas turned to him. "I'm proud of you," he said. "Not for what you did, for who you are." Ethan looked away, emotion tightening his throat. "I learned from the best." They didn't speak again that night. Words weren't needed. As the stars emerged and the apartment lights flicked on one by one, the two of them remained in the garden. 2 generations side by side, bound not by obligation or blood alone, but by the choice to see one another clearly and to stay when it mattered most. Legacy, after all, wasn't something you left behind. It was something you built moment by moment until one day it simply stood on its own, and Thomas Carter stood tall.